My mother died the night I was born. The doctor said it was complications, but I found her medical file 30 years later. And someone had signed off on denying her emergency care, that someone owned the hospital, and he was my father. Stay with me, because this story is about to go places you are not ready for. If you have never heard a story that made you question everything you thought you knew about power, money, and what it means to survive, you are in the right place. Hit that subscribe button right now, because the stories we tell here are the ones the world tried to bury, and we dig them up. Every single time. I want you to picture a hospital in rural Georgia. The year is 1994. It is late. The kind of late where the hallways are half lit and the staff is running on cold coffee and exhaustion. A woman walks in alone. She is 34 years old. She is a nurse herself, so she knows exactly what is happening to her body. She knows the signs. She tells them clearly, calmly, the way only a medical professional can, that something is not right, that she needs to be seen quickly. Her name was Celeste, and she was my mother. She had been in a relationship with a man who was, by that point, already building what would become one of the largest private hospital networks in the country. A man whose name was on buildings. A man who wore his wealth the way other people wear skin. Like it was just part of him, natural, unquestioned. He was not there that night. He was never there for most of the nights that mattered. But Celeste was there, alone, carrying me, and asking for help. She began hemorrhaging. The warning came in at 11:04 in the evening. A nurse flagged it, filled out the form, sent it up the chain the way the system required, and then the system did what systems like that do to women like my mother. It waited. It delayed. It weighed the cost of saving her life against a cost control directive that had been handed down from the very top of the hospital's parent company. The authorization to treat her was denied at 11:17 p.m. I was born sometime after that, and my mother was pronounced dead at 12:02 in the morning. I came into this world screaming. My mother left it in silence, and for the first 29 years of my life, I did not know any of this. I knew only what my grandmother told me, that childbirth is sometimes dangerous, that God calls people home, and that my mother loved me before she ever got to hold me. That was the story I was given, and I believed it. Because when someone you love hands you a story with that much grief wrapped around it, you don't pull at the edges. You just hold it and try not to break. My grandmother, everyone called her Nana Lou, raised me in a small house in Georgia with yellow curtains and a porch that creaked in the wind. She was not a wealthy woman, but she was consistent. She was present. She showed up to every school play, every graduation, every hard conversation a child brings home like a bruise they can't explain. She was the kind of woman who held entire worlds together with her two hands and never once asked for a thank you. But there were things about Nana Lou that I only understood much later. She flinched around money in a specific way. Not in the way that poor people flinch, that familiar tightness that comes from never having enough. This was different. This was the flinch of someone who had seen what money can do when it is wielded by the wrong hands. Every year, around the time of my birthday, an envelope would arrive. No return address, always cash, always the exact same amount. Nana Lou would take it, say nothing, and put it somewhere I never saw. I asked her once. I was maybe 9 years old. She looked at me with those steady eyes of hers and said, "Some things are not ready to be explained yet." And that was it. She had a way of closing a door so gently, you didn't even realize you were on the outside of it until you tried to push it open again later. When I was 12, I found a photograph tucked inside one of her old Bible pages. It was my mother, young, beautiful, genuinely laughing, sitting across from a white man in a suit at what looked like a nice restaurant. He was leaning forward, engaged, the kind of body language that says this man is trying to impress someone. My mother looked like she was winning. I had never seen her laugh before. I only knew her from grief, from the stories people told at her name, from the weight that settled over Nana Lou every time someone brought her up. So seeing that laugh, real and unguarded, cracked something open in me that I didn't have the language for at 12. I just put the photo back and pretended I hadn't seen it. But I never forgot his face. I grew up and I went into healthcare administration. Yes, I know. Of all the fields, of all the careers, I walked straight into the industry that had taken my mother. I don't think it was accidental. I think some part of me was always circling something even before I knew what it was. I understood hospitals from the inside. I understood the language of forms and authorizations and the way paperwork can either save a life or end one. I was good at it, very good. And then Nana Lou got sick. She was 81. She had lived a full life and she knew it. And she faced the end of it with the same quiet steadiness she'd brought to everything else. But in the last weeks, something shifted. She got restless, started asking me to sit with her more, started looking at me the way you look at someone when you are trying to memorize them. One afternoon, she pointed to the top shelf of her closet and told me to bring down the old shoebox. I had seen that box my entire life. It had always had a small lock on it. A cheap one, the kind that comes with a diary. But a lock is a lock, and Nana Lou had never offered the key, until now. She pressed it into my hand without ceremony, like she was handing me a grocery list, like it wasn't a bomb. Inside the box was a collection of papers that rearranged my entire life. There were letters, from a man named Richard Harlow. Early letters were warm, even tender. Then they became formal. Then they became legal. There was a signed N.D.A., my mother's signature at the bottom, and next to it, a payment amount that told me exactly how much Richard Harlow believed her silence was worth. There was a paternity agreement, documents establishing that he would provide financial support in exchange for no public claim on his name, his family, or his estate. And then there was a single sheet of paper that looked different from the others. Handwritten. My mother's handwriting. I recognized it from the one birthday card she'd written to me before she died, the one Nana Lou had kept. This was a letter she had written to Richard but never sent. In it, she told him that she knew he didn't want this child, that she understood he had a life and a family and a reputation that he was protecting. But she told him she was keeping me regardless, that I was not a problem to be managed, that she had enough love for both of them and she did not need his permission to become a mother. She wrote, "Whatever you decide, this child will know they are wanted. That is more than most people ever get." I sat on Nana Lou's bedroom floor and I read that letter 4 times, and then I just sat there, not crying, not moving, just sitting with the weight of 30 years finally landing all at once. Nana Lou died 3 days later, peaceful, in her sleep, like she had been waiting for permission. Grief is interesting. People think it makes you fall apart, and sometimes it does. But sometimes it does the opposite. Sometimes grief makes you very, very focused. I went back to work, and I started pulling records. Because of my role in hospital administration, I had access to historical patient files within a certain network. It took me a few weeks of careful, quiet searching. The kind of searching where you don't let your hands shake, even when everything inside you is shaking. And eventually I found it. My mother's file, hemorrhage flagged at 11:04 p.m. Treatment authorization requested at 11:09 p.m. The requesting nurse had documented everything properly, the rate of blood loss, the urgency level, the specific intervention required. It was all there, clean, professional, correct. Denied at 11:17 p.m. The denial came through a hospital administrator who was acting under a company-wide cost control directive. A directive that had been handed down from the parent organization, Harlow Medical Group, as a way of managing what they internally called high-cost intervention requests in their lower revenue facilities. Lower revenue facilities, that is what they called the hospitals in communities like the one my mother walked into that night. I want you to sit with that for a second. The man who fathered me had built a system so focused on profit that it denied emergency care at the hospitals serving the poorest patients, and my mother, a nurse, a woman who had spent her career inside that same system, walked into one of those hospitals alone and became a casualty of a policy her own partner had approved. He didn't pull the trigger. He built the gun, he loaded it, and he left it in every room. I found Dr. Reeves through the medical licensing board. He had been the OB on call that night. He was retired now, living quietly in Florida. I called him on a Tuesday morning, and when I told him who I was, he went completely silent. Not the silence of someone who doesn't remember. The silence of someone who has been waiting for this call for 30 years. He told me everything. He had flagged the case internally, had escalated twice, had been told, firmly by his supervisor, to stand down and process the denial as instructed. He had written his own private record of that night, kept it in a folder, never threw it away. He told me he didn't know why he kept it. I think he did know. I think he kept it because some part of him always believed that one day someone would come looking. What I did next, most people would call dangerous. I would call it inevitable. I applied for a senior role at Harlow Medical Group, using my professional credentials, which were genuinely strong, and my mother's maiden name. Not to hide, just to walk through the door before anyone thought to close it. I got the job. The offices were in New York, glass and marble and the quiet confidence of an institution that had never been seriously challenged. I showed up. I learned the culture. I did the work, and I did it well, because doing it poorly would have meant leaving early. And I wasn't ready to leave. I met Caroline Harlow in my 3rd week. She was Richard's daughter. His legitimate daughter, the one the world knew about, the one with the profile pieces written about her in business magazines. She ran the company's community health division, and she was nothing like I expected. She was genuinely passionate, frustrated with her father's priorities, pushing from the inside for the exact kind of policy reform that might have saved my mother's life. We became friends, real friends, the kind that happen fast and feel old. We had lunch twice a week. We talked about the broken parts of the system we were both supposedly fixing. She didn't know who I was, and I, for the first time since I'd found that shoebox, felt something that I hadn't felt in a long time. I felt seen, by someone who shared my blood, without either of us knowing it. Then Patrick Voss found me. Voss was Richard Harlow's lawyer. He had been his lawyer for over 30 years. He was the kind of man who had spent his career being the person who made problems disappear and who had the permanent expression of someone who had done that job long enough to understand exactly what it cost. He pulled me aside after a meeting one afternoon, led me to a quiet corner of the building, and he looked at me for a long moment before he said, "I know who you are, and I think it is finally time for someone to do what is right." He had drafted my mother's NDA in 1994. He had sat across from her and watched her sign away her right to name the father of her child, and he had carried that with him every day since. He told me Richard Harlow was not a stupid man. He had noticed things. My last name, my face, the way I moved through the building. He hadn't confronted it yet, but he would. And when he did, the window would close. Voss handed me a folder, 30 years of internal documentation, emails, directives, the original cost control policy with Richard Harlow's personal sign-off, everything I had found in my mother's file, and then 20 times more. He said, "Do what she would have wanted." And he walked away. I went to a journalist. Not out of rage. I want to be honest about that. There was no dramatic fire in me at that point. There was something quieter, something more like a commitment. My mother had been a nurse. She had spent her life advocating for patients. The least I could do was advocate for her. Before anything published, I asked for one meeting with Richard Harlow. Alone. He agreed. I think his lawyer had told him to. I think he still believed at that point that this was a problem that could be managed, that I had come for money, that everything had a price and this would be no different. I walked into his office with 3 things: my mother's photograph, the one from Nana Lou's Bible, the shoebox, and Celeste's letter, the one she never sent. He was older now, of course, but I recognized him from that photograph immediately. He looked at me from behind his desk with the careful, measured look of a man who has spent his life controlling rooms. And then I set the photograph on his desk and watched that control leave his face like air going out of a balloon. He knew. He offered money first. Then he moved to something that sounded vaguely like a threat, careful enough to be deniable, sharp enough to be understood. And when neither of those worked, when I just sat there and looked at him without flinching, he went quiet. I placed my mother's letter on his desk, right in front of him. I didn't say anything about it, I didn't need to, and then I stood up and I walked out of that building and I did not look back. The story published 6 days later. Federal investigators opened a formal inquiry into Harlow. Medical groups cost denial practices across their low-income hospital network within the month. Internal documents began surfacing. Former employees started coming forward. Dr. Reeves gave a full recorded statement, and Caroline called me. She had seen the story. She knew. Her voice on the phone was not angry. It was something much harder to hear than anger. It was the sound of a person who loves their father and has just learned something that cannot be unknown. She asked if we could meet. We met at the restaurant from the photograph. I had found it. It was still there, still running in Midtown Manhattan. I asked for the booth in the corner. I don't know if it was the same one, but it felt right to try. Caroline and I sat across from each other for a long time before either of us said anything meaningful, and then she said, "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry for what happened to your mother." Not for her father, not as a defense, just as a human being looking at another human being and acknowledging a wound. That was the moment I cried. Not in Richard Harlow's office, not when I read my mother's letter, not even at Nana Lou's funeral. But there, in that restaurant, across from the sister I had never known I had, I finally cried. And it felt like something releasing. Not healing, not yet, but releasing. Richard Harlow resigned from his company 4 months later. The federal investigation led to new federal guidelines around cost denial practices in privately managed hospital networks. Guidelines specifically designed to protect patients in underserved communities from the kind of administrative delay that had cost my mother her life. It wasn't justice, exactly. You can't legislate your way to justice for something like that, but it was change. Real, documented, enforceable change. He offered me his name one final time through Voss, a formal acknowledgement, a place in the estate. I declined. I took my mother's name instead. I changed it legally, quietly, without announcement, and it felt like the first thing in my life that was entirely mine. Caroline and I still talk. It is not simple. It will probably never be simple, but it is honest. And honest is something I have learned to value above almost everything else, because I grew up in a house full of love that was also full of silence, and I know now that silence, no matter how well-intentioned, always finds a way to surface. My mother came into that hospital knowing something was wrong. She said so clearly she was ignored. And 30 years later, the child she died bringing into the world walked into the boardroom of the man responsible and laid the truth on his desk without a single word of apology for doing so. She didn't survive, but everything she was, her intelligence, her courage, her absolute refusal to disappear quietly, it survived. It came through in the blood, and it waited and it grew, and it walked through a door that was never supposed to open. My mother named me before she died. Nana Lou told me that much. She had whispered it to the nurse holding me. A name that means to endure. I endured, and finally, so did the truth. If this story moved you, if it made you feel something real, then share it, right now, because the world is full of Celestes. Women who were ignored, delayed, denied, and forgotten. Women whose children are still out here carrying their silence. This story is for every one of them. Drop a comment below and tell me, whose story do you think the world still needs to hear? Subscribe, share this with someone who needs it, and I will see you in the next one. We are not done yet.